But there are 6 differences that are relevant to this datum. The literature on this is so enormous that I can only touch a fraction of it, and I'll restrict myself to a few cases where there are enormous data sets or meta-analyses that try to boil down the literature. The first difference, long noted by economists studying employment patterns, is that men and women differ in what they state are their own priorities in life. That, to sum it up, men on average are more likely to chase status at the expense of family. Women give a different weighting. Now, again, think statistics. It doesn't mean that women value family and not status. It doesn't mean that men value status and not family, nor does it mean that every last woman or every last man has this asymmetry. But in large data sets, on average, that's what you find. And just one example of this is in the study of mathematically precocious youth. In this case, 1,729 people who were selected in 7th grade for being in the top 1% of ability in mathematics. These are men and women who are, and then followed up decades later. They are certainly equally talented. If anyone has ever been encouraged at math and science, these kids were, both genders. They're equal in terms of their levels of achievement, and they report being equally satisfied with the course of their lives. Nonetheless, there are a number of statistical differences in what they say is important to them. There are a number of cases in which females rate things higher than males, such as the ability to have a part-time career for a limited time in one's life, living close to parents and relatives, having a meaningful spiritual life, having strong friendships. For the traits that men rate as higher than women on average, they include having lots of money, inventing or creating something, having a full-time career, being successful in my line of work. And it's worth noting that studies of highly successful people note that single-mindedness and competitiveness is a recurring trait in geniuses of both sexes. Now here's just one other figure from this data set. As you might expect, this sample has a lot of people who like to work Herculean hours, a lot of people who like to work 50, 60, even 70 hours a week, but there are slight differences at each one of these ranges. There's slightly more men than women who want to, don't care whether or not they have a life. Second, people versus things and abstract rule systems. There is a staggering amount of data on this because there's a whole field of psychology and economics that studies people's vocational interests. I bet most people in this room have taken one of those tests at some point in their lives. And there are consistent differences in the kinds of things that appeal to men and women in their ideal job. I'll just discuss one of them, which is a desire to work with people versus things, where there is that is a one standard deviation in terms of men over women. And indeed, this will tend to cause people to gravitate in slightly different directions. For the occupation that's strongest at the people end of this continuum is a director of a community services organization. The occupations that are strongest at the things end are physicist, chemist, mathematician, computer programmer, and biologist. And you see this not only in choice of whether to go into science, but also in which branch of science the sexes go into. Needless to say, from 1970 to 2002, there's been a huge increase in the percentage of degrees awarded to women. But among the PhDs, for example, you find a difference. We'll take the year 2001, that in education, 65% of the doctorates go to women, 54% of social science degrees, 47% of life science, 26% of physical science, 17% of engineering, which is perfectly predictable by the continuum between people and living things and inanimate objects. And this is pretty much the same in 1980 and 2001, despite changes in absolute numbers. Third, risk. Men are by far the more reckless sex. In a large meta-analysis involving 150 studies and 100,000 participants, in 14 out of 16 categories of risk-taking, men were overrepresented. The two sexes were equal on the other two, one of which was smoking for obvious reasons. And two of the largest sex differences were in intellectual risk-taking and participation in a risky experiment. And I think it's because of this that in everyday life, we do see such a difference. Men are very much overrepresented in the following category, namely the Darwin Awards, commemorating those individuals who ensure the long-term survival of our species by removing themselves from the gene pool in a sublimely idiotic fashion, in which I think virtually all, perhaps all, of the winners are men. Fourth, three-dimensional mental transformations, the ability to determine whether each of these pairs of objects represents the same three-dimensional shape. Again, I'll appeal to a meta-analysis, 286 data sets, 100,000 subjects, and the authors say we have specified a number of tests that show highly significant sex differences that are stable across age, at least after puberty, and have not decreased in recent years. In this case, the test, the advantage goes to the men, although, as I mentioned, the advantage goes to women in other kinds of spatial ability. But in mental rotation, spatial perception, and spatial visualization, there are sex differences tipping in the male direction. Now, does this have any relevance to scientific achievement? Well, we don't really know for sure, but there's some reason to think that it is, that three-dimensional spatial visualization is correlated with mathematical problem solving, and it figures prominently in the memoirs and introspections of most creative physicists and chemists, including Faraday, Maxwell, Tesla, Kekulé, and Lorentz, all of whom claim to have hit upon their discoveries by dynamic visual imagery and only later set them down in equations. A typical quote is as follows: "The psychical entities which seem to serve as elements in my thought are certain signs and more or less clear images which can be voluntarily reproduced and combined. This combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought before there is any connection with logical construction in words or other kinds of signs." And that is a quote from a fairly well-known scientist. Mathematical reasoning. Girls and women get better school grades in mathematics and pretty much everything else these days. And women are better at mathematical calculation, but consistently men score, at least statistically, better on mathematical word problems and on tests of mathematical reasoning. Again, a meta-analysis, 254 data sets, 3 million subjects, shows no significant difference in childhood. This is a difference that emerges around puberty, but there are sizable differences in adolescence and adulthood, especially in high-end samples. Here is an example of the SAT mathematical score, where there is about a 40-point difference in favor of men. That's pretty much consistent from 1972 to 1997. In the study of mathematically precocious youth, in which 7th graders were given the SAT, which of course ordinarily is administered only to college-bound kids who are much older, the ratio of those scoring over 700 is 2.8 to 1 male to female, and admittedly and interestingly, that's down from 25 years ago when it was a 13 to 1 ratio, and perhaps we can discuss some of the reasons. At the 760 cutoff, the ratio nowadays is 7 to 1 male to female. Now, why is there a discrepancy with grades? Do SATs and other tests of mathematical reasoning underpredict grades, or do grades overpredict high-end aptitude? At the Radcliffe Forum, Liz was very explicit in which side she takes, saying that the tests are no good, unquote. Well, one question is, why does every major graduate program, including MIT and Harvard, the very departments where Liz and I selected our graduate students by looking at GRE scores, still use them if they are so useless? And I think the reason is that compared to school grades, in which which often are affected by homework, by solving the kind of problems that have already been presented in lecture and textbooks, the aptitude tests are designed to test the application of mathematical knowledge to unfamiliar problems, which is, of course, the way that math is used in actually doing math and science. And in fact, I think contrary to popular opinion of Liz and many intellectuals, the tests are very good. There is an enormous amount of data on the predictive power of SAT tests. Among people in science careers, they overwhelmingly score in the 90th percentile in the SAT or GRE math, and they predict earnings, occupational choice, doctoral degrees, the prestige of one's degree, the probability of having a tenure-track position, and number of patents. Moreover, this predictive power is the same for men and women. As for why there is that underprediction, slight underprediction, 1/10 of a standard deviation in undergraduate grades, the College Board did do a study on that, and they were able to explain it by a combination of the choice of major, which differs among sexes, and the greater conscientiousness of women, solving that mystery. Finally, there's variability. Here it's crucial to, because estimates of variance depend on the tails of the distribution, which by definition are less numerous, and since people at the tails are likely to be weeded out of many surveys for various reasons, it's important to have large representative samples from national populations. And for this, the gold standard is the science paper by Novell and Hedges with 6 large stratified probability samples, in which they found that in 35 out of 37 tests, including all of the ones in math, space, and science, the male variance was greater than the female variance. One other gold standard data set is this graph of where the entire population of Scotland was given an intelligence test. What we have here, this is IQ, where the mean is 100, and this is the proportion of men and the proportion of women. And as you can see, there's a very orderly finding. In the middle part of the range, females predominate. At both extremes, males slightly predominate. Needless to say, there's a large percentage of women at both ends as well, but there is also a sex difference.